Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The Cobwebbed Library holds cursed tomes. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1, The Forgotten Section. The air in the basement felt heavier than usual, a damp, musty smell lingering as Marissa meticulously reshelved the last stack of books. The city's historic library had seen better days, but its charm was undeniable. Marissa loved it here. There was something comforting about the creak of the old wooden floors and the quiet that seemed to settle over the rows of dusty shelves. It was late, the kind of late that made the shadows seem longer and the silence almost too thick. As she moved a row of ancient encyclopedias, her gaze fell on something odd. There was a thin crack in the back wall, one that hadn't been there before. Marissa frowned, kneeling to inspect it more closely. Her fingers brushed along the seam, and with a sharp creak, part of the wall shifted. Heart pounding, she tugged harder, revealing a narrow, cobwebbed passage hidden behind a stack of forgotten crates. "What in the world?" she muttered under her breath, eyes wide. The entrance led to a small, concealed section of the library, sealed off for who knows how long. Dust coated everything, thick and undisturbed, like a blanket preserving the past. Old, faded books lined the shelves, volumes that didn't belong to the regular inventory. Drawn in by the mystery, Marissa ventured deeper, her fingers tracing the spines of the books. There was something unsettling about the place, an odd stillness, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Her hand stopped on one book in particular, the Grimoire of Forgotten Voices. The leather binding was cracked, symbols etched into it that she couldn't quite recognize. Despite the chill crawling up her spine, curiosity got the better of her. She opened the book. A gust of cold air swept past her, and for a moment, the lights flickered. Marissa looked up, frowning, but everything normal again. "It's just a draft," she told herself, though her voice sounded too small, too nervous. Flipping through the pages, her unease grew. The words were strange, some written in languages she didn't recognize. Symbols twisted across the margins, almost pulsating with life. As she turned the last page, a deep, low whisper seemed to rise from the very walls of the library, echoing around her. It was faint, just on the edge of her hearing. Marissa snapped the book shut, heart hammering. The cold draft returned, this time brushing the back of her neck. She turned, expecting to see someone or something standing behind her. But there was nothing. Just the empty, shadowed rows of books. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. It was just her imagination, wasn't it? But as she stepped back out of the hidden section, Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something dark. Something that wouldn't stay hidden for long. Chapter 2, Strange Happenings. Marissa barely slept that night. The book lay on her coffee table, its presence looming in her tiny apartment. She had tried to push the eerie events of the night at the library out of her mind, telling herself it was just fatigue. But every time she closed her eyes, she felt it. The whispering, the cold draft that seemed to linger in the corners of her room. She tossed and turned until sleep finally overtook her, though it brought no comfort. Her dreams were strange, unsettling. In them, she stood in the same hidden section of the library, surrounded by the books that had been locked away for decades. But it wasn't the silence that unnerved her. It was the voices. Faint, distant at first, but they grew louder, clearer. They were calling her name, Marissa. It was soft, insistent, as if something just out of sight was beckoning her closer. She woke with a start, drenched in cold sweat, her heart racing. The morning light was creeping in through the blinds, but it didn't feel warm. Everything felt off, When she sat up, something caught her eye, a faint mark on her arm, almost like a bruise. But as she examined it closer, she realized it wasn't a bruise at all. Strange symbols, much like the ones in the grimoire, seemed to be etched into her skin, faint but unmistakable. What the hell? Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. It was Jake, her childhood friend, and, in many ways, her only real confidant. He had heard about her discovery the night before and was eager to meet. Jake, the historian who had spent years obsessed with the library's past, was always grounded, always skeptical about anything supernatural. To him, everything had a rational explanation. Marissa met him at a local cafe. She needed to talk to someone to explain what was happening. "Let me guess," Jake said with a smirk. "You found something in the library, and now your overactive imagination is running wild?" Marissa shot him a look. "It's not like that. This is different. I'm telling you, something's wrong. The book I found, it's cursed, or haunted, or something. I can't explain it, but I've been seeing things. Hearing things. Seeing things." Jake's eyebrows raised. "Marissa, you're tired. This place is getting to you. A hidden section of the library is fascinating. Sure, but it's just old books. There's no such thing as curses." But he wasn't there. He didn't hear the whispers. He didn't feel the cold grip on his soul every time she thought about the grimoire. As they spoke, Marissa caught something out of the corner of her eye, a shadow flickering in the periphery of her vision. But when she turned, there was nothing. She didn't tell Jake about the symbols on her skin. She didn't tell him about the objects in her apartment moving on their own that morning, or how the whispers had started again just before she left. No, Jake wouldn't understand. But she was starting to realize something. The grimoire was drawing her back. She had to return to the library, no matter what it cost her. Chapter 3. The Librarian Who Disappeared. Marissa's hands trembled as she unlocked the library's front door the next morning. She had barely spoken to Jake after their meeting, his skepticism gnawing at her, but she couldn't shake the growing urgency inside her. Something dark lingered in the shadows of the library. The grimoire still called to her, its whispers now a low hum that buzzed at the edges of her mind. The library was empty when she arrived, the soft ticking of the clock the only sound. She hurried down to the basement, the weight of the cursed book heavy in her bag. Jake had agreed to help, despite his doubt. He wanted to look into the library's past. "Maybe there's something in the records that'll explain all this," he had said. Marissa was already a step ahead. She had spent the early morning combing through the city's archives, and what she found chilled her to the bone. Edgar Vance. The name felt familiar, though she'd never heard of him before. He had been the head librarian almost 50 years ago, well before her time. But he had vanished, just like that. One night, he simply disappeared, leaving behind no trace. The case had gone cold, his name forgotten by everyone except a few old newspaper clippings. Edgar found the section, she whispered to herself, the realization hitting hard. He opened the grimoire too. Jake arrived not long after. His expression was a mix of curiosity and concern as they sat down at one of the long oak tables with the dusty papers she'd found. "Edgar Vance," he muttered, flipping through the yellowed clippings. "So, he disappeared after finding that hidden section, and no one ever figured out what happened?" Marissa nodded, her fingers running along the spine of another old book she had retrieved from the basement. She hesitated, but then opened it to the last few pages. Hidden among the back pages were handwritten notes, faded, frantic scribblings that sent a chill racing up her spine. They were Edgar's. The early notes were neat, methodical, typical of a librarian. But as they progressed, the handwriting became jagged, frenzied. He wrote of the voices, of the cold that crept through the walls and into his mind. His thoughts scattered, spiraling into madness. The last entry was barely legible. The voices, they won't stop. They know me. They want me. The books, they're alive. They're waiting for me. I'm not alone. Marissa shuddered, pushing the notes away. But as she did, a voice whispered in her ear, a deep, guttural rasp that wasn't her own. Leave now, before it's too late. Her heart pounded. It wasn't Jake. She looked around the library, but they were alone. Yet, Edgar's voice lingered, his warning unmistakable. I can't, Marissa whispered, her resolve crumbling. The temptation to keep reading, to understand what Edgar had seen, gnawed at her. But deep down, she feared that she was already too far gone, just like Edgar. Chapter 4. The Curse Unfolds. Marissa stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her face stared back, but something was wrong. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent hue, and her eyes, they seemed darker, hollow. She blinked, trying to shake off the growing unease, but the reflection didn't blink with her. It lingered, distorted and warped, as if something behind the glass was watching her, mocking her. She stumbled back, knocking over a bottle of soap, her breath coming in short gasps. Her fingers trembled as she touched her face, the coldness of her skin unnerving. This wasn't normal. This wasn't her. Time had become elusive, slipping through her hands like sand. Days vanished, leaving her disoriented, trapped in a fog of confusion. She would lose hours, sometimes entire nights, only to find herself back at the library, the cursed grimoire open before her. Jake's concern had grown with each passing day. He had tried to reach her, calling, texting, but she avoided him. Deep down, Marissa knew he was right. She was changing, unraveling piece by piece. But something inside her had shifted. The more the curse wrapped around her, the more she felt drawn to the grimoire. I need answers, she whispered to herself. The library had become her second home. No, her obsession. The shadowy figures that once danced at the edges of her vision had become bolder, more present. At first, they flickered just out of sight, disappearing when she turned. But now, they followed her. She saw them even when she wasn't looking. At night, they stood at the foot of her bed, watching, waiting. Sometimes, she would hear the soft rustle of pages turning in the darkness of her bedroom. She would bolt upright, only to find herself alone, but the smell of old paper, of decaying parchment, lingered in the air. Jake finally confronted her one evening at the library. He stormed in, his eyes wild with frustration. Marissa, this has to stop. Look at you. You've barely slept. You're disappearing for days, and your apartment guard. It looks like you haven't been there in weeks. What the hell is happening to you? Marissa sat at the long oak table, the grimoire splayed open in front of her. She didn't meet his eyes. I'm fine. I'm close to something, Jake. This book, it's the key. I just need to understand it. Jake slammed his fist on the table, startling her. No, Marissa, this isn't fine. You're losing yourself. These books, this curse, it's eating you alive. We need to destroy them, now. She finally looked up, her expression cold, distant. Destroy them. I can't. You don't understand. There's more to this, more than we ever imagined. If I stop now, I'll never know what Edgar found. I'll never know the truth. Jake took a step back, his face tight with worry. The truth? Marissa, you're chasing a curse. It's not going to give you answers. It's going to destroy you. I can't watch this happen. anymore. Her heart twisted, but she couldn't let go. The grimoire called to her, its secrets pulling her deeper. Even as the shadows grew darker, even as the pages whispered her name in the night. "I'm not giving up," she said, her voice steady. "I can't." And with those words, she sealed her fate. Chapter 5. The Hidden Ritual. Marissa flipped through the brittle pages of the grimoire, her hands shaking as each ancient word sank deeper into her consciousness. Symbols and phrases that once made no sense were now disturbingly clear. The ritual was no simple incantation. It was a complex summoning, a dark binding spell that had trapped the souls of an ancient cult within the library. These spirits, now cursed, roamed endlessly, bound to protect the secrets the cult had taken to their graves. Marissa's reflection caught her eye again, but this time she didn't flinch. She was becoming accustomed to the warping, the disfigurement of her own image. The curse had become part of her, and with it, an overwhelming obsession. Her heart raced as the truth sank in. This was no accident. The grimoire had been left to lure those like her, seekers of knowledge. But now that she had opened it, the spirits wouldn't rest until they pulled her in completely. Jake stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept in days, consumed by his own worry for her. "Marissa, this is insane. You're telling me that those things were once people, cult members?" Marissa nodded, her gaze fixed on the open book. "Yes, the grimoire trapped their souls here. They were trying to protect the library's secrets they died for. The curse was meant to guard their knowledge. But there's more. I found the counter-ritual, something to break the curse, to free them. And us." He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "And what's the cost?" She hesitated, glancing at the final page, its words written in a language older than anything she'd ever studied. "The cost is me." Jake's face went pale. "What do you mean, you?" "The ritual requires a sacrifice," Marissa said, her voice steadier than she expected. "To stop the curse, I have to offer myself. I have to become the final soul bound to this place." "No," Jake said, shaking his head. "Absolutely not. We'll find another way." "There isn't another way," Marissa snapped, the words cutting through the tension. She softened immediately, her voice trembling. "Jake, I don't have much time left. The shadows, they're stronger. They attacked me last night. I don't know how long I can keep this up. If we don't perform the ritual, I'll be lost to the curse regardless." Jake clenched his fists. His logic, his reason, couldn't protect her from this. "Then I'll help. But we're going to find another solution. There has to be one." As night fell, they prepared for the ritual. The library was colder than usual, the lights flickering overhead. The shadows, once mere figures in the periphery, now lunged at them with more force. One knocked over a stack of books, sending them tumbling toward Jake. Another gripped Marissa by the wrist, its cold, invisible fingers leaving a deep bruise. They fought through the library's haunted maze, barely keeping the spirits at bay. Marissa's breaths came in shallow gasps as she laid the grimoire on the altar they had set up. The line between their world and the cursed one blurred more by the minute she could see the undead spirits walking the aisles, whispering words of madness, trying to drag her in. Their faces were gaunt, twisted by centuries of torment. The pages of the grimoire fluttered wildly in the windless room, the spirits clawing their way out of the pages. Marissa looked at Jake one last time. It has to be now. And with that, the final ritual began. Chapter 6. The Ritual Gone Wrong. The dim glow of candles flickered weakly as Marissa and Jake stood in the cobweb section of the library. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the building itself anticipated the horrors that were about to unfold. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of cold air, seemed to whisper of the inevitable doom. Marissa set the grimoire down on the dusty altar they had hastily constructed. Her hands trembled as she lit the final candle. Jake hovered beside her, his face drawn with tension. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the growing wind that seemed to swirl inside the room. "I have to be," she replied, swallowing her fear. The counter-ritual was their last hope, the only thing that could stop the curse, or so she believed. The shadows slithered along the walls, like living creatures, drawn to the energy building within the library. As the ritual began, the atmosphere thickened, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on them both. Marissa chanted the ancient words, her voice trembling as the pages of the grimoire fluttered violently, as though resisting the incantation. Suddenly, she froze. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, Edgar's warnings. They weren't about the curse itself. They were about the ritual. A cold dread washed over her, and her voice faltered. "Jake," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "The ritual, it's not to break the curse. It's to transfer it. Edgar didn't go mad from the curse he was trying to warn me. The ritual is a trap." Jake's eyes darted toward her. "What are you talking about?" "We're almost there." But it was too late. The moment she stopped chanting, the shadows coiled tighter and the temperature plummeted. From the walls, the spirits emerged phantom-like figures with hollow, soulless eyes. Their whispers, once faint, now became a cacophony of screams. The books on the shelves trembled, some spilling onto the floor as the library itself seemed to groan in agony. "Marissa!" Jake shouted as the ground beneath them began to tremble, the walls warping and twisting like a living nightmare. He reached for her, but the shadows swarmed between them, dragging her deeper into the cursed section. Marissa stumbled back, clutching the grimoire. The room around her dissolved into chaos bookshelves, stretched and twisted into a nightmarish maze, their towering heights blocking out any hope of escape. The books themselves whispered dark secrets, urging her to give in, to accept her fate. She spun around, calling out for Jake, but the voices drowned out her cries. The floor beneath her feet shifted, turning into a shifting sea of pages, each one inscribed with the curses of those trapped before her. The maze shifted, closing in on her, suffocating her with its endless knowledge and its inevitable pull. Meanwhile, Jake fought to reach her, his heart pounding in his chest as the spirits clawed at him, their hands icy cold and unrelenting. He grabbed a piece of broken wood from the crumbling shelves, swinging it wildly to keep the phantoms at bay. But no matter how hard he fought, they multiplied, enveloping him like a dark wave. "Marissa!" His voice was hoarse with desperation as he caught a fleeting glimpse of her, trapped within the maze. But as he lunged toward her, the shadows surged forward, slamming him to the ground. Marissa's vision blurred as the library seemed to stretch endlessly. The grimoire in her hands felt heavier, as if it were tethering her to this cursed place, demanding she finish what she started. But Edgar's voice echoed in her mind, louder than before. "Stop the ritual, or it will consume you." The last thing she saw, before the darkness closed in, was Jake's hand reaching out, only inches away too far to save her. Then, everything went black. Chapter 7. Trapped in the Cursed World. Marissa gasped as her eyes fluttered open, her heart racing in the eerie silence. She was no longer in the library's cobweb section, but in a warped, grotesque version of it. The familiar scent of old paper was replaced by a sickening sweetness, as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing in and out like a bloated creature. Pulsating, Fleshy cobwebs clung to the shelves, their movements a sickly mimicry of a heartbeat. The books, once silent sentinels of knowledge, now whispered ominous chants, their pages turning on their own, each rustle echoing in her mind like a taunt. Marissa stumbled to her feet, dread pooling in her stomach. Every step she took resonated through the warped space, her sanity fraying with each echo. "Jake!" she called, her voice cracking under the weight of despair. The name felt foreign in this twisted realm, as if the very air around her sought to suffocate her pleas. She took a cautious step forward, her senses on high alert, the whispers growing louder, pressing in on her from all sides. Shadows danced just beyond her vision, and she could feel the chilling presence of spirits watching her, waiting for her to slip further into madness. In another part of the cursed library, Jake pressed against the crumbling wall, breathing heavily as he fought to catch his breath. The shadows still clawed at him, but he was determined to find Marissa. He rifled through Edgar's final notes, each page covered in erratic scrawls and desperate pleas. They were laced with madness, but hidden within was a chilling revelation. "There's one more secret," he murmured to himself, scanning the frantic handwriting. "A way to save her, but at a terrible cost." His heart pounded as he absorbed the words, an ancient incantation that could bind the curse back to its source. Yet the price was steep, the sacrifice of the one who awakened it. "Marissa," he whispered, fear gnawing at him. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, but what choice did he have? He had to find her before it was too late. Back in the cursed world, Marissa pressed deeper into the library, the walls closing in around her. The whispers transformed into shrieks, echoing the agony of past victims ensnared by the curse. She glimpsed fleeting figures, their faces twisted in terror, each one begging for release from the horror that bound them. "Help us," they cried, their voices blending into a horrifying chorus that made her skin crawl. The spirits took on monstrous forms, their bodies grotesquely distorted, their hollow eyes searching for something she could not provide. "Leave me alone," Marissa screamed, her voice rising in desperation. But the shadows surged closer, their icy fingers brushing against her skin, drawing her deeper into their grip. As she fought against the pull of the curse, she felt her grip on reality slipping. The library twisted around her, bending and folding as if mocking her attempts to escape. Panic rose within her. She could no longer tell what was real and what was a figment of the curse's dark power. "Jake!" she shouted again, but the echoes of her own voice mocked her. She had to find a way out, to break free from this nightmare before it consumed her entirely. But as she pressed onward, the shadows swirled, and she realized with horror that the cursed world was not just a prison, it was a reflection of her own fears, and it was closing in fast. Chapter 8. The Final Choice. The darkness in the library thickened, swirling like a living entity as Marissa pressed deeper into the cursed realm. She could feel it pulsing around her, a sinister presence drawing her closer to the heart of the curse. And there, at the center of it all, stood the figure of a man, cloaked in shadows, his eyes glowing with malevolent intent. "Welcome, Marissa. I am the one you seek, the leader of the cult that sealed this fate upon the tomes. I offer you a choice." The entity gestured grandly, and the walls trembled as the faces of trapped souls twisted in agony flickered into view, their hollow eyes pleading for salvation. "You can join us, surrender to the curse, and become one with the library, forever wandering its halls, an eternal guardian of its secrets." Or his voice lowered, thick with malice. "You can sacrifice your friend, Jake, breaking the curse, but dooming him to become part of my collection." Marissa's heart raced, her breath quickening as she grasped the enormity of the choice laid before her. Surrender herself to an endless existence within the library, or condemn Jake to a fate worse than death. The weight of her emotions bore down on her. He was her childhood friend, her ally in the fight against the darkness that had invaded their lives. "No," she breathed, shaking her head, her mind racing. She thought of all they had been through together, the late nights spent in the library, the dreams they had shared of uncovering its mysteries. There has to be another way. In the dimness, she could feel Jake's presence growing closer, his determination igniting a spark of hope within her. But he was still trapped in the shadows, fighting his way through the horrors unleashed by the curse. "Jake," she cried out, her voice barely a whisper amid the oppressive darkness. But the spirit laughed, a cruel, chilling sound that echoed through the warped library. "He cannot hear you, dear Marissa. He is too far gone, just as you will be if you don't choose soon." Tears welled in her eyes, the truth cutting deeper than any blade. "I won't sacrifice him," she shouted, defiance rising within her. "There has to be a way to break this curse without losing him." The spirit's smile widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Then you shall face the consequences of your foolishness." With that, the shadows began to close in, swirling like a storm around her. Marissa felt the weight of the tomes pressing against her mind, the whispers intensifying, urging her to give in to despair. Yet through the chaos, a flicker of an idea ignited within her. She thought of Edgar's notes, of the final secret that Jake had discovered, the ritual that might bind the curse back to its source. Perhaps there was a way to exploit the spirit's offer against him. "I'll find a way," she vowed, her voice steady now. "You won't take either of us." Just as the shadows lunged for her, she reached deep within, summoning all the courage she had left. "I refuse to become your pawn." In that moment of clarity, the cursed world around her quaked. The spirit's face contorted with rage, and for the first time, Marissa felt the power of her will begin to push back against the darkness. With a sudden rush of energy, she channeled the knowledge from the grimoire, her voice rising above the din as she recited an incantation she barely understood. As the shadows writhed, a blinding light enveloped her, illuminating the twisted library. "Jake!" she cried one last time, the light pulsating as she fought against the curse that sought to consume them both. And in that heartbeat, as the darkness recoiled, Marissa's fate hung in the balance, an uncertain whisper carried on the wind of the library, echoing the eternal struggle between light and shadow, freedom and bondage. Would she and Jake escape, or would they become part of the cursed legacy forever?